to be working in New England. I'm a born and raised Rhode Islander. I'm also the father of two sets of twins, so I like to say God's got a funny sense of humor. They're all in their 20s, so I am thanking the good Lord for a very wide bandwidth because I've got three that are in college, in the house, doing most of their work remotely. So bandwidth is a premium here, and hopefully we won't have any interruptions. So again, just an absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. This has become very personal to me over the last decade or so, looking at how dramatic the changes have been in our climate and in our weather patterns here in the Northeast. As I said, I'm a born and raised Rhode Islander, born in 1967, and things are a whole lot different now than when I remember growing up as a kid in the late 60s and 70s, and certainly over the last 10 or 15 years since I've been at the helm of the Northeast River Forecast Center. So I'm going to talk to you tonight a little bit about the drivers behind what we believe are causing the changes that we're living through. I'm going to let the data speak for itself. I'm not going to get too geeked out in the science with you, but I want you to see some of the data because it really is dramatic, some of the changes that we've witnessed. And to me, as a hydrologist and a meteorologist, when you are forecasting the movement of water through our river systems and our reservoirs, we're going to be one of the first ones to notice if Mother Nature is changing things because we calibrate our models on the behavior of the rivers and streams over 50 to 100 years of historical record. And the models that we've calibrated, we're having to go back and take a second look at now because the changes have reached a point where they are so dramatic, we actually are changing the way we're looking at the history and actually doing our modeling. So I started off by saying this is a personal thing to me, and it really, really is. This is my hometown of West Warwick. I was born in Cranston. We moved to West Warwick in 1976. My dad was a science teacher at Deering Junior High School and later West Warwick High for over 30 years. So you can see I was kind of born into the science bug. But this was one of my religious experiences, I guess, as if having two sets of twins won't do that to you, because it sure did. But this one on a science and on a forecasting profession level really opened my eyes. I grew up in this watershed. I grew up in West Warwick, went to not only the junior high and high school, but I am standing that morning of March 31st, 2010, on the steps of St. Joseph's Church, where I happened to make my confirmation back in 1982. Why is that an important factoid? Well, in 1982, this river basin set its flood of record. The weekend I was making my confirmation. And I remember seeing the water trickle up to the intersection, which would be over here on the left-hand side near the Route 33 sign, trickle up to the intersection. You're looking at that intersection 2 to 3.5 feet underwater with trailers underwater. The first floor of the elementary school submerged, tractor trailers submerged, bus stops submerged, CVS with the water halfway up through its front doors. I never, ever, ever thought I would see this watershed, the Patuxent River Valley, succumb to this kind of devastation. So this began our investigation for my river center. And as you'll see in a minute, we cover all 6 states of New England and much of New York State. It began our voyage into looking at what's going on. What has changed? Why are we seeing this remarkable increase in these truly catastrophic floods all throughout my service area? So that's a bit of what I'm going to share with you tonight, but we're going to take it from a Rhode Island perspective. So we'll stop by looking at our changing climate, and then we'll look at the data, the rainfall, the temperature trends, and how that's affecting the behavior of our rivers and streams. And then, of course, Sakonnet River, right? We're sitting on the ocean. We have to talk about sea level rise and the ramifications of what that has already begun to do with the king tides, with full moon tides. And certainly as storms like Sandy and Irene have shown parts of the southern New England coastline, the awful ramifications of even a sub-major hurricane and the tremendous impact it's having on our coastline now due to the sea level rise that we've already experienced. I will end by a couple of high notes. Number one, some of the remarkable best practices that communities are using to truly stem the tide of all the flooding. And a new tool that my River Center is helping to deploy, which will provide actual forecast of inundation along many of our rivers and streams. throughout the region. So a boatload of good stuff I hope you'll find as we go through this. So first, a little bit about your tax dollars. I work for NOAA, per the emblem on my shirt. And this evening, in honor of Abigail, I happen to be wearing my climate change tie. If you look closely at this little puppy, it's got little grid marks of different colors of blue and red. And as you voyage down to the very bottom tail end of the tie, you'll see it's all red. This is indicative of the remarkable change that the globe has experienced over the last 150 years in how our temperatures have warmed. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So NOAA, the National Weather Service is who I really work for. We are part of the NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Around the country, we have 13 river centers like myself. I happen to cover the northeast part of the region, covering most of New York and all 6 states of New England. We actually also do forecasting for our Canadian brethren in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick provinces. And I have a couple of really, really long-standing, wonderful relationships with our Canadian partners. We work very closely with other federal and state agencies, Department of Environmental Management, Water Resources, Corps of Engineers, U.S. Geologic Survey, who quite frankly, they control and run and operate hundreds of river gauges in the region. I wouldn't have a job without them. So I always give a shout out to our colleagues at the U.S. Geological Survey for both their scientific research and the remarkable work they do to maintain hundreds of river gauges throughout the watersheds here in New England. My office's mission is pretty straightforward. We are to provide the nation with river, flood, and water resource forecasts for the protection of life and property and the enhancement of the national economy. And that is why we fall under the Department of Commerce. So as a river center, our whole responsibility is to take what the meteorology drives, meaning the rainfall, the snowfall, the storm surge, the winds, and so on, and to actually predict how that water is going to behave when it hits the ground. So the meteorology is what comes out of the sky. The hydrology is what happens to it when it hits the ground. And we use a series of different modeling techniques that we have calibrated by using the history at our watersheds, the gauge history, the precipitation history, to calibrate the movement of that water through the different soil layers and eventually into our rivers, streams, reservoirs. And in my case, either down the St. Lawrence Valley and into Canada or directly into the Atlantic. And we do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We do it for rivers large and small. In some cases, for the smaller watersheds, we'll provide an amount of rainfall needed to produce flooding. But over the last couple of years, we've been building out and maturing a new national water model that runs at very high resolution. That is allowing us for the first time to actually predict stream flow on many, many small rivers beyond the larger ones that I forecast for throughout the Northeast. Here in Rhode Island, the large rivers that we do forecasting for on a daily basis include the Blackstone, Patuxent, Wood, and Pawcatuck. But with the help of the National Water Model, as you'll see at the end of this presentation, we're now on the cusp of actually being able to provide not only forecasts, but forecasts of inundation for river and small stream flooding, really down to the street level, as you'll see at the end. So as a river center, again, we're all about the water or lack thereof and helping to move that forecast information to our weather offices and to our emergency management partners and water managers throughout the region to help them do their job of managing the resources and protecting life and property. Now, my river center supports the weather offices. The weather offices are the folks that issue those severe thunderstorm warnings and high wind warnings and so on across the region. All of Rhode Island is served by the office that's co-located with my river center in Norton, Massachusetts, the Boston Norton Weather Forecast Office. The Weather Forecast Offices take my information as part of a global set of data, and they're the ones that compose the warnings, like the severe thunderstorm warning you see in red on the upper right. They're the ones who activate your cell phones. They're the ones who turn on NOAA weather radio and get the broadcast going. So they're kind of our boots on the ground. They provide the forecasts and the warnings to our partners. And my river center supports the entire water mission that they are responsible for warning for. So that kind of gives you a bit of an overview of how we are constructed as a federal agency, with my river center serving 8 states in New England and neighboring Canada, and providing our information so that the folks at the weather offices can get the warnings out for you. All right, so let's talk about the drivers for our ever so slightly warming planet, or not so slightly nowadays. I'm going to keep this pretty short, and I'm going to talk through what I feel is the most remarkably powerful loop that I could possibly show you that illustrates why we are concerned and illustrates how dramatic just one of the gases in our atmosphere has been, carbon dioxide, and how much of an indicator it is for just how different our planet is today than it ever has been based on all of the historical records, ice cores, et cetera, that we can look at. So what we're going to see here is a loop, first over the last decade or two, and then we're going to take this back several 100,000 years. The data shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The information comes from a very robust data set at Mauna Loa and on the South Pole that were mined by scientists over the decades through ice cores in these locations. The ice cores are able to trap in a frozen state a snapshot of what the atmosphere was composed of at that time. And the item that they've isolated in this remarkable loop is the carbon dioxide signal, CO2. And in a moment, I'll show you a graphic of why this is so telling and so important in helping us understand why our planet has warmed so much and why we're concerned in the direction that we're going. So we're going to start the loop in 1979. You'll notice that Mauna Loa, being a mid-latitude location, does have a very classic diurnal signal to the concentrations of CO2, whereas at the South Pole there's much less diurnal variability, day-to-day, month-to-month variability. Scientists have always said that the critical plateau is 350 parts per million. You'll notice that we went through that plateau in 1990, and we have continued to rise dramatically ever since. The reason for the rise, we believe, is a large part due to urbanization, burning of fossil fuels, amongst other things. Yes, there are planetary variations that we know have gone on for the millennium, but this dramatic rise is the most significant one we've ever witnessed. Now, as the loop continues backwards in time, you'll notice now we're back to 1200, 800. Soon we're going to go back before what's considered the current epoch, the last century or two. You will notice when you compare where we are now, closing in and exceeding 400 parts per million, the planet simply has never been here before. Now, yes, there's been variability. We've certainly seen periods of time over thousands of years where the CO2 signal was up to 300 parts per million. We have never, ever seen it in the location that we are at today. Why is this an important signal for us? Because based on the latest science, there is a clear correlation to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to the global temperatures. The black solid line is simply a reference mark from 1880 to 2010, approximately, of where the CO2 concentration has been. In this, in the bars, is indicative of the global atmospheric temperatures with respect to the long-term global average over this same time period. So you can see quite clearly the correlation to when we had sustained cold globally in low concentrations of CO2 to this remarkably high period that we are in now. And we believe that this is a direct correlation. Now, there are certainly other gases that are contributing to this. And we know that it's really a blanket effect. As you increase concentrations of certain gases, just like you put a blanket on at night to be warm, because that blanket traps your body heat and pushes it back or radiates it back toward your body to warm you up. So too does the atmosphere. When you put gases into the upper atmosphere, they act as a blanket and actually cause long-wave radiation that's trying to escape the Earth to be reflected back down, causing a slow warming trend of both ocean and air temperature, atmospheric air temperature. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we have seen and what the science speaks to. So let's take this from a global perspective and let's start coming down to our region. How is this really playing out? So from a meteorological standpoint, what happens over the poles is tremendously important to the behavior of the weather patterns around the hemisphere. On the right-hand side, you're looking at a loop of the ice cover over the North Pole, over the Arctic region. In September from 1984 through 2016. And you will notice that as this loop progresses, each September, which is typically the time of year when that ice cover is at its least extent because it's the warmest the planet is during the year, notice the remarkable drop in the cover. And it's not only the amount of ice there, it's also the thickness of the ice, because the ice thickness is directly correlated to the ability of the Earth to radiate out to space. So as the planet has warmed, we have seen a precipitous fall in the average ice cover, nearly by more than a third from 1979 to 2019. This is having an effect on the atmospheric circulation because our jet stream is driven by temperature contrast. And as we slowly erode the ice, and when it builds back during the wintertime, it gets to its full cover for the most part, but it does not retain the thickness it had. So slowly but surely, we've been losing the Earth's ability to radiate some of that heat back out into space. Well, at the same time, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that as we trapped all of these gases in the upper atmosphere, we're having more radiation that's trying to escape reflected back down on the Earth's surface. So from a meteorological standpoint, this is tremendously significant because we are seeing changes in the atmospheric regime, in the jet stream patterns that are featuring blockier atmospheric weather regimes. And what we mean by blockiness is we mean they get stuck in a rut. And we wind up for 4 to 6 to 8 weeks kind of in the same flavor. Now, when it's a southeast ridge, we tend to be dry. We have seen that happen this summer with a rapid onset of very dry conditions. But when we're on the wet side of this, we can have things like the October 96, one massive slow-moving rainstorm. We can see multiple storms in close succession like we did in 2010 during the month of March. So it is all, in my opinion, much of this is really being governed by the behavior of the weather patterns, which are being influenced by the loss of Arctic ice. So again, what are the conditions that we're witnessing? We are seeing slower moving weather systems. Researchers at Chicago University, Florida State, Rutgers University have looked at a principle of mathematics called sinuosity, which measures curvature in the flow. And they've used this property to look back over the last 60 years at how our jet stream has behaved. And they have found a significant shift toward this blocky type of weather regime. Now, the way that manifests itself over our region is you can have multiple events in close succession. 2010, the winter of 2014-15. If you recall that winter, that was the one with the ice dams, with the remarkable amounts of snow we had. If you recall, though, what really happened that winter? We didn't have a flake of snow until the end of January, and then she didn't stop snowing until the end of February. We had 4 to 5 weeks of winter. We got stuck in a rut. In 2010, we got stuck in a rut. We were warmer because we had an El Nino going on in the Pacific at the time. That typically makes the atmosphere a little warmer over here in New England. But what happened to us? We got stuck in a rut. We had 5 big weather systems in 4 weeks. 5 big rainstorms. The last one set the world on fire over Rhode Island and southeastern New England with remarkable catastrophic river and small stream flooding. So that's how this is playing out. Now, there's another ingredient to this. It's not just the jet stream. The oceans have warmed. So what you're seeing in this loop on the left-hand side of your screen is atmospheric water vapor. Water vapor is the seeds to making raindrops. They are the fuel for hurricanes, along with the ocean heat content. Now, you'll notice that there is these little filaments that break off and head poleward. You see a really strong one here. These are called tropical plumes. They come up at our latitude a couple of times a year. They've been around the planet forever. But in this kind of blocked up atmospheric regime, 2 things are happening to these water vapor plumes. Number one, we're seeing them get up into the northeast area, in the northern latitudes with greater frequency. And because of the atmospheric warming and the ocean warming, these plumes are now carrying more water vapor than they ever have. I give you Hurricane Harvey on the Texas coast as one example. Texas, everything's big in Texas, right? The state of Texas, they have tropical cyclones, hurricanes, tropical storms every summer, mostly. On average, these storms have typically produced 20 to 30, sometimes 40 inches of rain. Well, one of the last reconnaissance flights that went through the eye wall of Hurricane Harvey before he made landfall sent one of those little packages, we call them drop sounds, that measure atmospheric moisture, wind, and temperature all the way to the ocean. They measure the highest content of water vapor we've ever measured before in an aircraft sounding. Is it any accident then that Hurricane Harvey dumped 65 inches of rain on the state of Texas? The behavior of that storm wasn't any different, other than it was a little bit slower than we've seen in movement. But it had an awful lot of remarkable water vapor to work with. Hurricane Florence, another great example on the Carolina coastline. Or how about Tropical Storm Irene, which dumped 16 inches of rain over the Schoharie Valley in about 15 hours. These are all examples of how the atmospheric regime, warming oceans and atmosphere, and increased water content in our atmosphere are literally raining down on parts of the country in a very dramatic way. Why New England? Because we can interact with these tropical plumes because of where we are on the planet. You know, most of our storm systems either drop out of Canada and tap the Atlantic, or they come right up out of the Gulf and the deep tropics and up the eastern seaboard. It can happen in the wintertime, it can happen in the summer, spring, and fall, it doesn't matter. And this is why we're seeing the changes that we are seeing on our rivers and streams, all driven atmospherically. So in a nutshell, you know, my office has been doing this research since 2010, and these are kind of the highlights. Increased annual precipitation, that's both rainfall and the water equivalent of what snow falls. Increased heavy rainfall events, these real intense rain events. Warming temperatures annually. Wildly varying seasonal snowfall. Just because warmer doesn't mean we're not going to snow. But what we've seen in snowfall is wide variability. It's not that we don't snow in the winter anymore. What's happened is we're seeing remarkably snowy years up against incredibly lean years like last winter was. And then with respect to droughts, it's not that we're droughtless. They are far less frequent, but they come on very rapidly. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. We've seen shifts in the frequency of these events, which has a lot to do with designing stormwater, wastewater, the systems that move water about. And for the smaller watersheds, we've really seen the increase both in flood magnitude and flood frequency. And it's extremely pronounced where we've had significant land use change, urbanization. These seem to be the calling cards of where we've had the biggest struggle in dealing with these things. Now, you notice here, I've got a picture from Patton, Maine, 2012. I've got a picture here from the Mother State floods in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's not just a Rhode Island problem. It's happening all over New York and New England. So a little bit about the data. What you're looking at here is a graph from 1930 to 2019. You can go ahead and make this graph yourself if you so desire by going to Climate at a Glance. NCDC NOAA Gov, CAG stands for Climate at a Glance. So the reason why I chose 1930 was we're looking at river flooding. At least my office was to start this. And most of our river gauges were installed after the 1927 floods or after the 1936 and 38 floods. So we wanted to use the richest period of historical river data that we had at our disposal. So we just arbitrarily picked 1930. You can go back to 1905 for the reports in Rhode Island if you would like, but the trends are the same. So you're looking at the annual temperature every year from 1930 to 2019. Annual temperature is simply taking your high and low every day, divided by 2, that's your average daily temperature, then sum those up over the days of the year and divide by 365. And that's how you calculate your average temperature. The data supporting this is not just the data at TF Green Airport. It is the data from numerous sites with various periods of record throughout the period 1930 to 2019. The trend is unmistakable, is it not? And the key here is, remarkably, we are warming at 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit every 10 years. In my lifetime, I'm 53, we've warmed every 10 years, that's almost 1.5 degrees just in my lifetime. But what is remarkable to me are these trends. First of all, note that the top 10 warmest years, only one of them has occurred since prior to 1970. And look at the bottom end of this. Look at the cold years. How dramatically different a cold year is by today's standard. So much so that the coldest year we've experienced in the last 40 years is still warmer than the old average from the 1930s. Think about that for a minute. That the coldest year we have experienced in the last 40 years is still warmer than the old average of the 1930s. If you look around you, is the vegetation not changing? Are we not seeing invasive species come into the area? Why are we seeing all of these airborne tick-borne illnesses like triple E, eastern equine? They're getting into our latitudes because of the warmth, because of our inability to kill them off in the wintertime. The same thing with infestation of algicides and such that are killing our vegetation. For me, up here in Cumberland with our white pines, I mean, they're dying from the root ball up. We're being strangled by the invasive vines. You're seeing bird life come into the area that we've not ordinarily seen here. It's all responding to it. That's how dramatic the warming trend has been and continues to be here just in Rhode Island. Rainfall, equally as impressive. Again, 1930 to 2019. We are averaging now an extra inch of rain every year, each decade. That's a remarkable increase. Now, first off, the dry years aren't as dry as they used to be, right? If you look back to 1970, we had 1 year where we were under 40 inches for the year. Our average over this time frame is 46. So it's not as dry as it used to be. It doesn't mean that we can't have a major drought. But in this kind of regime, they're going to be short-lived. And what we're finding is that they're coming on rapidly. We go from one extreme to the other. And that affects agriculture first, because the vegetation can't take that kind of stress. And when it begins at the heart of growing season, or in the months of May and June as we're beginning to bloom, it's crushing on agriculture. It truly is. Where are we in 2020? Well, we're right here at this green dot, but we've still got a month and a half to go. I suspect we're going to end up with, 4 or 5 inches of precipitation the next month and a half, and we're going to end up being up in here, probably comparable to what we experienced in 1980. That's my guess. But this is dramatic. And look at the frequency of these years with more than 55 inches of rain. Now, it's not just that we're wet or wet more often. We're seeing shifts in when the wet occurs. Winter, spring seems to be a hot button. Late fall seems to be a hot button. Late spring, summer is when we tend to dry out and dry out rapidly, very quickly over a short period of time. 2018, our third wettest year on record. It also set a new record for the number of days that we had more than 1 inch of rain, which you see here, 22 days of more than 1 inch of rain in any one day. Now, there have been others out here. 1972, that was a big El Nino year. 1955, Connie and Diane, big tropical year. But this one is a standout. We've never before had that many days. And you can look at it in Portland, Maine, with the number of days of greater than 2 inches, how they are pretty much clustered, 5, 6, 7, 8 days like this, all in the last 30 years or so. These are the trends we're seeing all over New England. Now, I briefly mentioned, the changes in precipitation frequency, the likelihood or frequency of seeing a particular rainfall value. That is so important to how we design our stormwater, how we design our reservoirs, how we design the spillways on the reservoir, how much capacity do they need to hold back the rain, how much capacity they need to pass that rainfall, the size of the culverts, the size of the pipes from which the culverts put the water into. Every one of these elements and the way we have designed that infrastructure has been driven by these analyses of precipitation frequency. What you're looking at here is the latest atlas produced by NOAA about a year and a half ago now. And this particular rainfall value that you're looking at is the amount of rainfall that I would want to design for if whatever system I'm building has to be able to handle what we call a 100-year rainfall event in 24 hours. What that really is the probability of this amount of rain, a 1% probability of that rainfall happening in any given year. So for our region, if we were designing a system that has to have the capacity to handle that 1% chance rainfall event in 100 years, right? We'd be designing for 7.5, 7 3/4 to 8 inches over our region. The dilemma is so much of our hardened infrastructure was designed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And a lot of that infrastructure was built off of the old atlas. which said, yo, you only have to design for 6.5 to 7 inches of rain. So for much of our region, we've experienced anywhere from a ½ inch to as much as a 2-inch shift in that design storm. And we're seeing these play out over different design criteria. It could be a 1-hour rainfall. It could be a 1-day rainfall. It could be a 6-hour rainfall. And in many of the state departments of transportation who paid to have this atlas updated actually in the last few years, they are now slowly but surely beginning to incorporate these new design numbers into the requirements for licensing new development. If you've wondered around the region as you've traveled about why the retention ponds are so god-awful large now, if you've driven up and down Interstate 295 at all lately, you'll notice that they've done a lot of work with drainage in some of those 295 corridors. Why? Because they know they've underdesigned, that we've got an infrastructure that is woefully underdesigned for the new regime we are in atmospherically with the frequency and intensity of the rainfall. Now, have droughts become a thing of the past? No. This is the Palmer Drought Severity Index that we use. It's part atmospheric and part historical model that basically takes the accumulated precipitation over time and looks at soil moisture and its own numerical computation of how that plays out, and then calculates an index. The more negative, the more intense the drought. So if you just focus your attention on the period in the 1930s, 50s, and 60s, you'll notice that we had many years, so these are yearly averages, many years where the Palmer Drought Index was well below -2 and even below -3, and that these episodes were 2, 3, 4, even 5 years in duration. Look at the behavior of the drought in the last 20, 30 years, with really one exception. This period of time here in 2014, 15, and 16, most of our droughts have been short-lived. They've only been a year long, maybe 2. Where we are right now is we are just shy of -3 for the year 2020. I suspect that when the year is said and done, we're probably going to land somewhere up in the -2, -2.5, which is about what the other episodes of drought have averaged over the last 40 years. This is pretty dramatic. So droughts haven't become a thing of the past, but they've become a little less severe because their duration is shorter, but they're very intense because atmospherically we kind of go from one extreme to another. So very quickly, we look at the riverine response. These two graphs give you an idea of how the flood frequency has changed across southern New England watersheds, like the Blackstone, the Patuxent, the Wood River, which is this cluster here, and some of the tributaries in the Merrimack, the upper Merrimack here in New Hampshire, the lower Merrimack here in Massachusetts. You'll notice that in most cases, every one of these locations that my office forecasts for, we've seen a dramatic increase in the percent likelihood of seeing flooding since 1970. There are locations where we haven't seen that, but in almost every case, I can point to one of two things that has caused them to be able to survive and not see a dramatic shift in flooding. They are either watersheds that are protected by Army Corps of Engineer flood control reservoirs, or they are basins like the Charles and the Ponset, where communities willingly gave up land to put the land back to its natural state to protect the watershed, so that nature was given back the land with the vegetation and the trees and the grasses to be able to absorb what nature's throwing at her. Now, does it mean they don't flood anymore? No. But in the case of the Neponset, it takes 2010 to get a record flood there now. So just a couple of examples for you. The floods are coming in different shapes and sizes, from urban flash floods like we saw here in September of 2018 to the catastrophic floods of 2010, which was 4 massive rain events in a span of 5 weeks. The last event kind of tipping the balance, producing widespread record flooding statewide. So where are we headed temperature and precipitation wise? Based on the latest state summary from the international research community for Rhode Island, while we have already experienced about 1.5 degrees of warming, projections show that even with modest emissions, we could see additional warming of anywhere from 4 to perhaps 6 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. That truly is remarkable. And it's going to play itself out by the increased number of days with temperatures above 90, with increased days where the minimum temperature can't get below 70, and a decrease in days with minimum temperatures below freezing or below 0 degrees Fahrenheit in both cases. So the combination of these ingredients, we believe, is going to result in this continued warming. And this truly is a kind of an uncomfortable place to be at, because what we're really doing on the planet is we're dramatically losing latitude. Already, the amount of warming we've experienced puts Rhode Island in a place where Delaware was in the 1940s. And that's how dramatic the shift has been. If we warm by this much, we're going to be in a climate closer to perhaps Virginia or North Carolina, which almost seems impossible. But those are what some of the projections are showing. With precipitation, equally is an uncomfortable story, right? We're looking at a projection of anywhere between 5 to over 8% increase in precipitation atop what we've already experienced. And we've already experienced about a 10 or 12% increase over much of New England. Again, the focus from the modeling results seems to say that it's going to be in the winter and early spring where we see the heaviest shifts, with drier, more intense dry and warm periods in the midsummer into the early fall. And again, these episodes of what we call these flash droughts, I think will become more commonplace if this scenario continues to evolve the way it is. So that's the inland river flood, rainfall temperature piece. I'm going to briefly speak about the coastal flood threat, because with sea level rise, this has become, I think, an even more noticeable issue because it is sensible. Rivers and streams and the flood threat, those are compartments of opportunity. Along the coastline, everybody's in it because the sea level is going up everywhere. So again, with these web links, you can go look at this data yourself if you'd like. On average, over the last century, the upper part of Narragansett Bay has seen nearly 0.8 of a foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years. Newport, nearly 1 foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years. And the rate of rise over the last 2 decades has increased dramatically along much of the eastern seaboard. That is partly being driven by the acceleration of ice loss over Greenland. Not entirely driven by it, but to a large degree, driven by that, to a lesser degree by what we call thermal expansion, because the oceans have warmed several degrees as well. What this is resulting in is what we experienced just a weekend ago on the king tides, with minor coastal flooding over parts of New England without a breath of wind. As the sea level rises, you have these king tides, the moon tide, the full moon tides. We're seeing water levels now that are inundating the near shore area, the parking lots, the backyards, and so on and so forth. And we expect this trend to continue. On top of this, of course, we have the added concern of these big systems. The big nor'easters devastating the coastline of eastern New England, Massachusetts, Cape Cod, Maine, and New Hampshire. And these tropical systems, or these fall, what I call hybrid events like Sandy, half hurricane and half winter storm, that with their slow movement and their constant battery on the coastline, coupled with sea level rise, has us in a place now where it doesn't take a Category 3 hurricane to have catastrophic coastal flooding. And if you just recall some of the pictures from Sandy along the shore of Westerly and Musqueamican, these were my pictures. I walked this beach 2 days after that event, and I was shocked. We were briefing the governor of Rhode Island at the time to prepare for an inundation that would make it look like a Cat 2 hurricane came through, even though the system was not making landfall near us. And I was really humbled by the amount of devastation I saw down there following Sandy. And it really speaks volumes to our vulnerability along our coastline. And in the Sakonnet Basin, we've got quite a few locations that have never been more vulnerable to widespread coastal flooding than we have today. One of those most popular spots, of course, Island Park and Common Fence Point at the upper part of the Sakonnet River. These areas have never been more vulnerable because of the sea level rise atop these increasingly more powerful storm systems that we're seeing. The graph on the left is simply a Google Earth image. On the right is the Army Corps of Engineers analysis of storm surge inundation based on category of storm. And you can see the vulnerable areas in this region. This entire region changes dramatically with just 1 additional foot of sea level rise. Areas that were inundated by a Cat 3 will now be inundated by a Category 2. Areas where it would take a Category 2 will now be inundated by the Category 1. You see the trend. That's what has us concerned as sea level rise continues. If we go down to the very southern end of the Sakonnet River, you'll notice the same dilemma. While we don't have the population density and development that we do up at Island Park and Common Fence Point, we certainly have vulnerability nonetheless. Cutting off, if not, removing roadways, the small villages in here, just remarkable what is happening before our eyes. Slowly, but it's happening. And again, my concern being that with time, it won't take a Category 2 to inundate parts of these areas. It'll take a Category 1. And that is really what's kind of frightening in the whole grand scheme of how do we plan our communities? How do we prepare for this? What can we do? So with sea level rise, where are we headed? The state of Rhode Island has taken a very aggressive stance. And I got to say they're one of the few states that's really, really done so. And they should be applauded. Through their special area management planning, their beach area special management planning, the beach SAMP, they are focused in on a potential additional rise of 3 to 6 feet of sea level by the end of the century. And that range of solutions comes from these various changes in the emissions of gases into the atmosphere that are leading to the warming of our planet. If we get lucky and we're able to temper things, maybe we'll stay closer to 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise. But the concern, just based on the rate of rise that's already transpiring, really has them focused in on this range of 3 to 6 feet over the next 50 to 100 years. And that's unsettling, because any of us who know the coastline realize we don't have that much wiggle room on our coastline. We are also going to see a pretty dramatic increase in these what we call nuisance floods, these full moon type floods, where we get tidal flooding now into what used to be dry areas, where we're maybe having to shut down roadways for a couple of hours for a few days around high tide. And what this is looking at is the number of tidal floods that we can expect as a function of the days in a year. So, we know that we have 2 high tides every day. By 2050, conceivably, we could be getting flooding, on every 4th high tide. It's crazy to comprehend that. Right now, it takes a king tide. It takes one of the supermoons to have that happen. So we kind of see these maybe 2 to 4 times a year. And now we're thinking of seeing these 50 times a year. That's very dramatic. And it speaks to the dilemma that we're in along our coastline. So it's far-reaching ramifications, no doubt. Floodplain use, land use, infrastructure, spillway, the drainages. How do we handle this? What do we harden? What decisions do we have to make? What things do we need to be considering? To a degree, it comes down to what the Danish call the old protect, adapt, or retreat question. Can we protect the asset? Is it worth the investment to try to protect that asset? Can we adapt the surroundings to help deal with maybe coastal flooding or increased rainfall? Or do we have to retreat? Are we finally at a point where, as I jokingly tongue-in-cheek say, along the coastline, I have to consider giving it back to Shamu, because we simply can't sustain the infrastructure that's there? These are not simple questions. They are not. What some states are now considering is looking beyond the FEMA 100-year floodplain and really looking at how do we legislate and license and build out, and what do we allow to go on, maybe in the 200 or 300-year floodplain, a little bit outside the normal. Now, it's not all bad news. Necessity becomes the mother of all invention. And that's never been truer when we look at our river valleys and our coastline. So here you have a couple of examples of real world, real life examples of what communities have been doing to try to stem the tide of impact, to become more resilient against climate change. The upper left is that example I talked about in the Charles and Neponset River Basin, where you have the ability to put the land back to the way it was. It works. It shows it works and stands the test of time. That Neponset Charles Basin is a great example to me. Building for the new normal. This is along the Patuxent River, where they took the old Royal Mills and turned them into pretty high-priced condominiums. But they did something very unique. They gave up the first 2 floors. They gave up the first 2 floors, put all the critical infrastructure higher up, put all the living apartments higher up, put the parking in those 2 lower levels, so that when the river floods, they can robocall all of the owners, get everybody's cars out, and let the water clean the parking lot in the parking garage so that the livable space is not impacted, so that the infrastructure, the electrical, heating components are not succumbed by the flood. So smart construction. Here, the town of Chelsea, a wastewater treatment facility, dealing with both riverine and coastal flood threat, did a hydraulic and a hydrologic design study, and they have gone in and they have elevated all of their critical infrastructure. Put them up on blocks, get them up higher, get them out of the 100-year floodplain, put them up above the 500-year if they can. They did a cost-benefit analysis and found that taking the time, putting the money into this would give them far more longevity in the life cycle of that particular wastewater treatment facility. This is an example here, Providence College, bioswales and porous pavement. This area used to be a hard pavement, and the college was having issues with ice formation, slipping, and during heavy rainfall and runoff events, the water actually making its way into some of these buildings because the rate of runoff was so rapid during these intense rainfall events. So they brought in some environmental design engineers, and they came up with a really unique concept of using a combination of porous pavement and bioswales, which some of you might be familiar with, where you dig down a huge retention area and you put a mixture of materials that allows the water to be purified and cleaned up as it makes its way into this storage containment area. But that water sits there and is delayed in its response to get into the drainage system and out into a nearby river or stream. By taking this and doing this, not only is it now a beautiful location on campus, but they've completely removed the flood threat and the ice and slipping hazard by taking a very unique engineering and environmentally sound approach by using bioswales and porous pavement. So it's a great example of some of the new green technologies and how well they're working. And lastly, on the coastline, elevate or evacuate. You really have to look hard at some of our coastline communities to think long and hard if we want to keep them there. And Lord knows the financial ramifications of relocation in a coastline. That's big tax base money, but it's very vulnerable. And the insurance industry is getting tired of reinsuring and insuring and insuring, and the rates have gone through the roof in the last decade or two, partly driven by all of the hurricanes on the East Coast. So these communities are now taking a really hard look. Can we sustain the development through techniques like elevation, setback, modest setbacks? Can we do it through beach replenishment? Or can we do it through hardened structure, seawalls, which tend to be a nice thing for what they protect, but often have negative ramifications upstream or downstream of where such a fixed structure is placed? Or do you truly have to consider that this particular parcel of real estate isn't long in the tooth if we continue with the rates of sea level rise? There are communities that are struggling with this. The Roy Copperner's Beach portion of Charleston is one location, or South Kingstown rather. Roy Copperner's, there's some cottages, but they are stacked on top of one another with not much of a buffer left. Parts of our coastline have experienced over 200 feet of beach retreat in the last 70 years. You're not going to fight that. And nature sure isn't going to give it back. So they are really struggling with what do they do as a beach community? How do they make themselves resilient? What can they do? Can they put everybody up higher, make it safer? Do they have to retreat? How do you do that? Hurricane Sandy took a couple of homes right off the beach, the first row homes. And Hurricane Sandy was a sideswipe. She was a hurricane that made landfall over Jersey that gave us a right hook. We never had sustained hurricane force winds here. We had a 4.5-foot storm surge. And look at the damage it brought. What happens when we get another Carol, a Category 3, with a 10-foot storm surge in that community? Those are hard questions. We have some tools of the trade, but at the end of the day, especially on the coastline, it comes down to the community's intestinal fortitude. How dedicated are you to trying to save it? Or other ways to go about this through relocation or through other means of engineering and designing to give that community or that parcel of real estate some longevity and some resiliency. I want to end by showing you what your tax dollars are doing, because we in the Weather Service understand this is going on. The questions that we're being asked are more complex, and what folks want is as much information as we can give them. What you're looking at on the right here is a zoomed in portion of the Sakonnet River Basin. And these small little gray lines are some of the rivers and streams that feed into the Sakonnet River that we are now able to predict and forecast in real time using the National Water Model, complementing what my River Center does. Where we are going, as my center is doing as part of a Department of Commerce priority goal, which is being reported quarterly up to the president, we are now beginning to produce real-time inundation forecasts for many of the watersheds throughout New England and New York. I want to give you just a brief example of some of the exciting things to look forward to. This is the middle portion of the Patuxent River in Cranston, West Warwick, and Warwick. This is Interstate 295. Interstate 95 is here, north to the top, south to the bottom. This is the Warwick Mall. This is the Rhode Island Mall. This is the West Warwick Treatment Facility, and St. Joseph's Church is over here. So we kind of come back to the beginning of my talk. We, for the first time now, have the capability to not only issue a river forecast in Cranston to say how high the river will be, but for the first time, we are now able to provide an assessment of where that water is going to be on the ground, not only for the main stem Patuxent, which you see in the darker blue shading, but also for some of these smaller tributaries that feed into the Patuxent. And what you're looking at here is an actual rerun of our forecasts during the 2010 floods in March of 2010. And what you're seeing here is what our forecast could have been of the inundation footprint for that flooding. I wish to God I had this when I was briefing Governor Carcieri. Because when he asked the question, Dave, how bad? The only words I could use to describe were, Governor, I'm scared, and it's going to be biblical. And we're going to go over the previous flood 2 weeks ago by feet. But I couldn't tell him where. We didn't have this capability. The proof is in the pudding. This was the impact. Where you see the yellow circles, that's where we had flooding on the interstates, the on and off ramps. And where you see these pictures, well, they clearly validate the power of what we're trying to do as an agency in getting this type of inundation information to our emergency managers in real time. Now on the coastline, we have the storm surge forecasting capability, which has been around for 30 years and has served us very well. This is the first time that we're trying to do this here along our rivers and streams. And it's an immense source of pride for me that my River Center was selected as just the second center in the country to accelerate this new technology into our service wheelhouse. We're actually going to be conducting a tabletop exercise with some of the impacted communities in February of this year to get this in front of our partners for the first time here in Rhode Island. My office will be running a second one for the Schoharie Valley of New York following the devastation from Irene, doing a very similar thing. So it truly is an exciting time. And as I said at the very beginning, you know, this 2010 flood was kind of a hallmark event for me personally. Having grown up in this area, having my mother still living up in Arctic Hill near the West Warwick High School where I grew up as a kid. But the changes are very real. The changes are not easily fixable without communities dedicating themselves and organizations like yourselves dedicating themselves to trying to exhaust all the avenues we have at our disposal from a science and from an engineering standpoint to try to make our communities as resilient as we possibly can in the face of this remarkable shift in our climate. So with that, Abigail, thank you for the opportunity to spend an evening with all of you. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you folks have.
Video. Yeah. Oh.
David, I'm curious. You showed the graph of Sakonnet, you know, the Sakonnet River Basin, which here we are bordering Massachusetts with the Westport River, right?
Yes.
To our east, right? To what extent are your models bound by state boundaries versus kind of considering the watersheds that cross those boundaries?
We are agnostic to state boundaries. What I mean by that is we don't know them. They don't exist. We have driven both our river models and our small stream model all by the actual hydrology. It's by basin delineation, by the way the water moves. So the state boundaries we know nothing of state boundaries. We are forecasting from the headwaters to the river's mouth. And what we try to do is find out who owns what structure where and who is controlling the movement of water on some of these small tributaries that may affect the larger rivers, like the Westport, for example. But state boundaries, they have nothing to do with how we forecast. We are governed by what nature has on the ground for us in the way of the delineation of the terrain and the watershed itself.
Dave, okay, as Sakana Preservation, we're in the business of preserving open space, woodland, the natural environment, and in a greater sense, the rural character of Little Compton. Could you just talk about how conserving open land, natural spaces, particularly those, near wetlands or near bodies of water and coastal zones, is in a way a major resilience building factor?
It absolutely is. And in our region, again, I would point to the success in the Neponset River and Charles River efforts back in the 1970s with their natural valley storage approach. It, in essence, conserved land. It kept it or put it back to its original state. And you just don't see the frequency of flooding there like we do in other watersheds. So I think every effort that is made to conserve, to keep the land in its natural state, or God willing, you're able to put some of it back to the way it was, it is an effort worth funding and pursuing because it works. It has demonstrated that it works. I think the biggest challenge is on the coastline because there you're losing beachfront. You're losing the natural grasses and the ability for the dune systems to have longevity. It's a little bit more violent there because of, in some cases, wave action. But inland, away from the coastline, these natural approaches do work. And it's I can't speak highly enough of every effort made to do that because it helps to stem the tide and it does build a level of resiliency.
Are there any other questions from anyone?
I thought I saw one just pop up in the chat. Yeah, I'm actually looking at the chat. Let me see.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. So Abigail, I can save this presentation for you also as a PDF document that you can share on your website if you'd like. I will get that to you after.
Okay, because I know that map of Sakonnet went by very quickly. And I was looking, okay, where's Taylor's Lane and where's Route 77?
Yeah, absolutely. And on the slides too are the links to the Corps of Engineers repository for all of that stuff I showed you. So another question here is Boston called you in your work about the harbor barrier ideas. So that's a great question. We have interacted with the city and with the state at various levels. They've actually been very proactive. They've done a Herculean amount of engineering studies looking at all of the possible ideas, both for the harbor and also for the infrastructure of the interstates and the tunnels, on looking at what can they do to stem the tide of flooding, because they get it from both ends. They rely on the Charles River and Amelia Earhart dams to keep the ocean flood waters from going upriver, just as much as they rely on those projects to pump water out of the watersheds when it's the heavy rainfall coming in. So they've actually done a remarkable amount of work, to their credit, on spending the money on the design and on the infrastructure studies to begin to identify kind of a punch list of what they need to do. And we know part of Boston was built on fill. And as sea level rise goes, boy, those places are going to be the first spots that feel it. And that's why Boston's been so proactive, to their credit, to take this head on.
How do you sleep at night, Dave, with all you know?
That's funny. Because I'm usually exhausted by the end of the day worrying about a lot of this. That's why I sleep well. I guess I'm just an eternal optimist that I have faith in our ingenuity. We've got enough really smart people, and I include some of you in that group, that really understand this, that realize this is real. It's not a game. It's not a political chess match. We live in these watersheds. I grew up on one of them, and it's personal, and we've got to do things differently. But what do we battle? We battle the dollar, right? On the coastline, it can't move me back, or the community, I can't afford to lose the tax base. Well, then it's someday you're going to lose lives. And that's what I can't stomach. We have the techniques and the ingenuity, but do we have the intestinal fortitude to stick to it? That's the challenge. But organizations like yours, grassroots organizations of people that care, that's where it starts, because that's where we begin to move the mountain, because it has to come from the people in the community. Now, we are fortunate that we have a couple of congressmen and senators who have dedicated themselves to championing these efforts. We've got a very, very well-oiled climate team at the state level, their climate commission, where they've tapped academia, researchers, the business community, and folks like myself to work collectively on these issues. So Rhode Island actually is in a pretty good spot. But again, it takes that grassroots effort, because it's from your conversations that you have with your local selectman or the mayor or the town council or what have you. You know, when the next box store wants to come in and lay a couple of 1,000 yards of concrete and pavement, because they want the tax base, right? I've driven to visit Little Compton periodically, and oh, God bless you for trying to keep the quaintness of that community. It's got to be done. It really does. I live up here in Cumberland, and what a dichotomy between the northern part of the town where I am, where we've maintained the Diamond Hill in the state park, and we've kept the trees, and we've got acreage, you know, per lot minimum and all that, versus the very southern end of town when you knock on the door of Central Falls and how dramatically different it is. Yet we're all in the Blackstone Valley. You know, we got to keep hold of what we can so that they don't lay pavement down on everything we own.
Which, Abby, can I ask a question?
Yes, go, please.
David, so you just mentioned Central Falls. So the social equity issues related to flooding are, I mean, you're kind of the technical guy, but I'm sure you're not unaware. And I'm not familiar enough with your corner of Warwick to know if there was residences for lower income people.
There were, and they were devastated.
And they were devastated. And
they were devastated. Yeah, because
as
some of the lower income housing in were old mill houses that were turned into living facilities like that for lower income. And I mean, I vividly remember speaking with one young woman who had a child, maybe 10, 11 years old. And if you recall, that time around 2010 was right before Easter. And, I was there on the grounds of the church, like everybody else, just staring in amazement. And, she comes up to me and she just starts talking, and she just started. And I don't know if she recognized the Norway emblem on my jacket that I had. And this woman, probably in her late 30s with a young child, single, pointed to the apartment that was now 2-3 feet on the water. And she said, I had everything for Easter on the kitchen table. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have the money. I don't know where to move. I don't know what's going to happen to the dwelling. Man, if that doesn't shake you at your roots, nothing does. And that was in West Warwick, which, isn't Central Falls by any means. But a lot of these, lower income communities have been built up along the rivers because of the leftovers behind the textile industry moving out. And, where they haven't burnt the factories down, we've either turned them in the shopping areas or we've turned them in the housing complexes. It's a great point you make, though. That's a huge obstacle, huge challenge for any community to face. In the river communities, I contend it's so much harder. Coastline, you typically have a wealthier base, right? Just because it's so expensive. And the rivers and streams is just the opposite in many places. A lot of these communities grew out of the 1800s and the textile boom. in the mill housing, and how we've kind of turned those over. In some places, they've turned them into higher end, but in many places they haven't. And those folks are the ones that have the hardest time recovering after any kind of natural hazard.
Mhm. Mhm. All right, and thank you for your work in the Schoharie Valley. I was in the Adirondacks the weekend before Irene, and then as soon as I could get back in, because I was working on my Adirondack 46ers that year. And wow, that
Yeah.
was an amazing amount of water surrounding Keene and Keene Valley, and the firehouse washing away.
It's just devastating. It truly was. Thank you.
Well, Dave, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Abigail. Glad I could do it.
Sharing all the information so willingly with us. It's really terrific.